Eva, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, a podcast for knitters who share my fascination with the nitty-gritty details of our craft. If you're a returning viewer, it is so nice to see you again. I apologize for the break. I did explain it on Instagram, but in case you're not there, essentially Thistle injured her back in February, and she was on crate rest, and she wasn't really supposed to be walking. And my boyfriend's house has a backyard, and it's very snowy here, and he has a snowblower, so it just made a lot of logistical sense to just stay over there. But my computer is a big desktop computer, and that's what I use to edit my video, and so obviously I didn't bring that with me. And that is why it has taken so long to record another episode. But Thistle is doing well. She's laying right here on the couch next to me. Here she is. When she was first injured, and there was no trauma about it, she just suddenly couldn't use her back legs one night. So when that started, she really couldn't walk at all and could barely hold herself up even to go to the bathroom. But thanks to crate rest, she is doing much better, and she is now able to take a 10-minute walk, and hopefully she will be able to walk even more in the future. But yeah, so I thought I would show her now just in case you were worried, and she's still super happy. She gets to spend lots of time on the couch, in the bed, hanging out with me, even if she doesn't get to frolic in the woods right now. So I know, you want to go back to your nylon? Oh no, you'd rather hang out? Okay. If you are a new viewer, welcome. I'm so glad you found your way to my little corner of the internet. And as I mentioned, I have been on quite a break, and so I've decided to kind of ease myself in with podcasting by just talking about 3 sweaters, one in the past, one in the present, and one in the future. And so this is not going to follow the typical format of any of my episodes. Usually I'm either talking only about works in progress, or I'm talking about finished objects, and then I include lots of other segments that are knitting related. But today I'm just going to talk about sweaters, so it won't be representative in the format, but I'm still going to be talking a lot about knitting and a lot about the nerdy details of knitting, so it's representative in that sense. Okay, so I have not been doing a lot of knitting, honestly. 2018 has been a very interesting year so far. Between Thistle's illness and adjusting to being in a new space that wasn't my own, also getting into board games, which I had never really had an opportunity to play before, like the more strategic board games. Obviously, I've played Monopoly and Pictionary and those kinds of things with my family growing up. Anyway, there are lots of reasons, both good and bad, why I think that knitting took a back seat, but yeah, my knitting has slowed way down. I guess I'm in a knitting slump, but I'm not that stressed about it, so that's why I hesitate to use the word slump, which seems very negative. But because of that, and because I'm not really sure how much knitting I'll be doing over the next few months, I might have to experiment a bit with format, in which case you'll just have to bear with me. But for today, I happen to be at a place where I have one completed sweater, one sweater that I'm working on, and then a sweater that I'm plotting for the future. So I thought it would be fun to do kind of like a ghost sweater episode. So first up is the Ghost of Sweater Past, and I started my Blue Bonnets cardigan in January, and I only finished it, I think March 28th I sewed the buttons on, which is a long time for me to take over a sweater. But that's okay because I finished it now. Unlike any other sweater I've knit, it has shorter sleeves because I used up both of the skeins of yarn that I had. It's a farm yarn. It's 100% Rambouillet. I think that's how you say it in American. Which is a fine wool breed of sheep. And I cannot remember the name. I think it's Lanai Yarns. I was sent it as a wonderful gift, and then I overdyed it with Kool-Aid and Wilton's icing dye to get this kind of blueberry color. Also Blue Bonnets, because my family lives in Texas, and I've spent quite a few years in South Texas, and I love how in the spring, especially in April, blue bonnets just start covering the ground, and since April is my birth month, I really like that. So for my spring cardigan, I wanted it to be inspired by blue bonnets. And what I did was I chose a lace pattern that has a lot of vertical columns in it. And I'm going to actually grab a picture of blue bonnets for those of you who don't know what they are. Hopefully between those close-ups and then me backing away from the camera, you got a good sense of the general idea of the shape and fit and design of the sweater. Any like poofiness is because my dress underneath has a ruffle going all the way along it. I said I would show you a photo of blue bonnets, and here they are. Whoops. Okay, hopefully that gets rid of the glare. So they're a column flower, kind of like foxgloves. And that's why I really wanted a vertical lace motif. And the one that I found, I also wanted one that would be easy to memorize. So I found one that it's only a 4-row repeat and all the wrong side rows are rest rows. However, it looked best knit, like it looked best sitting in this direction, top down. And that's not how I like to knit sweaters. I like to knit sweaters bottom up. So because I knit this sweater in pieces, I first knit the back piece in plain stockinette, and I knit that bottom up. Then I knit the front pieces in the lace pattern top down. And then I knit the sleeves in the round while playing yarn chicken, hence why they ended up so short. But I actually really love this length. It turns out it's incredibly functional for me living in spaces with central heating. I can wear this and not get overheated, which is amazing. So I'll probably try some more sweaters with maybe a little bit longer. Anyway, but okay, so in the round, and then I did the sleeve cap flat, and I seamed it all together. This was supposed to be a relaxing, quick, simple knit, and that really didn't happen. The back was pretty simple. Because I used yarn that I had overdyed myself with Kool-Aid and Wilton's icing, I had 2 skeins, so I had to alternate, and so that added like 1 level, right? Because you've got 2 giant cakes of yarn, and then you have to alternate every couple rows, so you have to drop the yarn and pick up the other yarn. So that wasn't really my favorite. And then for the front panels, this lace pattern makes a much more dense fabric than stockinette. Usually lace is a little more open than stockinette, but in this case, if I used, I think I knit, maybe, I used a 2, I think, maybe a 2.5 for the back. I think it was a 2, and I got 6 stitches to the inch. Whereas if I used that same needle size for this lace, it went to 9 stitches to the inch. And obviously, first I was playing yarn chicken, so I didn't want it dense. Second of all, I don't want a bulletproof sweater. I want one that's comfortable. So I had to go up several needle sizes. Oh wait, actually I knit the fronts on 2.5, so I must have knit the back on a 1 or something. I don't know. This is a woolen spun farm yarn, and so that's why I knit it a little more loosely than I would have, even though it is a fingering weight. So I ordered straight needles to try, which I think I talked about in my last podcast. I'm so sorry if I'm repeating myself. I don't watch my own podcasts, obviously, and it's been so long that I can't really remember what I talked about and what I didn't. But I ordered a pair of straight needles to try in Licca, which is a wooden needle with quite a blunt tip. And that shouldn't have been a problem because this lace didn't require a lot of stitch manipulation. But I think because the yarn is on the stickier side, it was just not at all enjoyable for me to knit these front pieces. The actual physical experience of knitting, I was knitting right-handed, I was throwing, and usually I'm pretty happy knitting either way. I'm a little faster continental, but usually I'm happy either way. But something about the combination of having to alternate yarn so much and throwing and the yarn kind of sticking, because the Licca needles are much stickier than the wooden needles that I usually knit with, which are Diet Craft Darn Pretty. It was physically not at all enjoyable. And so it took me forever, really, to get them done because I just didn't want to pick it up. The other thing was that, being me, I decided that rather than just decrease at the sides for the waist shaping, I wanted to both decrease at the sides and decrease in the middle because I really like how that makes the sweater fit. I think that, let me show you when I unbutton it completely. It makes it sit really nicely and fitted even when it's unbuttoned, but then when you button it, you've still got enough space that nothing is getting pulled. So I just really, I like the shape of that sweater best. It seems to fit me best. And I have about a 10-inch difference between my waist and bust, which is, what, 25 centimeters. So it makes sense to me to spread those decreases out. I have knit sweaters where I'm only decreasing at the side seams, and I don't like how they fit as much. So I thought it would be fairly simple to shape in this lace pattern because I was working top down, so I got to decrease rather than increase, and it's always easier for me to maintain the pattern when I'm decreasing. Something, my brain just works better that way. Usually if I have to maintain a pattern while increasing, I have to pull out my graph paper. So I thought it would be pretty simple, but even though this is a very straightforward pattern, as far as it's only 4 rows, and you're doing almost the same thing on each of the right side rows as well as the wrong side rest rows, but it is staggered, so it's offset a little bit. And so that made it tricky to figure out how to maintain the pattern on the sides while decreasing in the middle and and it was a bit tricky to see if the lace was still lining up until you were several rows down. And so I tried a couple decrease options before settling on one that I liked, and then I took enough notes that I was able to recreate it for the other side. The nice thing is one cardigan front when you're knitting in pieces really isn't that big, so it wasn't a huge deal to have to pull back and do it again. And let me, okay, let's see. So I'm not sure how well you can see how that lace changes, but that's what I ended up doing. And I was pleased with the results. So I finally finished both the fronts, and then I weighed my yarn, and I was sure that I was going to run out. I wasn't even sure if I was going to have enough for the sleeves. And as I said, I really didn't enjoy physically knitting the fronts, and so at that point I was just going to give up and frog it. But my boyfriend encouraged me to stick with it, so I was like, okay, I'll knit one sleeve, because at least it's mainly stockinette. I still really didn't enjoy the physical act of knitting this, which is weird, because usually I love knitting sleeves and I love knitting stockinette. So I don't really know what it was. And also I was using my regular wooden DP ends, and I got a not much tighter, but a bit tighter gauge than I did on the back, so I don't know if I was just stressed at that point and pulling the yarn tighter. But I managed to get through one of the sleeves. So I got through one of the sleeves, and as you see, I made them as short as I felt would still look reasonable. I was worried if I went any shorter, it would be weird because it's a cardigan. I don't know why the idea of a short sleeve cardigan seems weird to me. It's not like other people wearing them look weird. I don't know. Anyway, and I weighed the yarn I had left, and it weighed less than the amount of yarn in this sleeve. So at that point, once again, I was like, well, I might as well just quit on this sweater. But my boyfriend encouraged me again to keep going, and my kitchen scale isn't hugely reliable. When I got it, it was one of the first tools I bought myself, and I was still a fairly new knitter. Oh, but this part is from the blocking, in case you're wondering why that's sticking up. I got impatient and like draped it over something so it would block faster and didn't pay attention to what that was doing. Anyway, I bought it when I was a fairly new knitter, and I didn't really think I would use it that much, so I just opted for a cheaper option instead of, you know, spending 5 or 10 extra bucks and getting a high quality one, because in my mind I didn't think it would be worth it. But it turns out I use my scale all the time. So eventually I'll probably upgrade it. But yeah, so I decided to go ahead and knit the second sleeve, mentally preparing myself to run out of yarn right around here. But I managed to finish that sleeve, and I was super excited, so I seamed it all together, and I thought that it looked pretty good. So I did the neckband, and at this point I was playing serious yarn chicken. And so all I had left for these bands were the swatches, and I had already expected to have to do the button band in a contrasting yarn, which I did on another sweater of mine that I played yarn chicken, and I really liked the result, so I picked out a contrasting yarn. I was like, that's okay, it'll work. But then I managed to finish up both the bands, and I used I think I was left over with maybe that much yarn from the second swatch. So I used up every last bit of those two skeins. But I am so happy with the result, and I'm really glad that I stuck with it with some encouragement, because even if it wasn't the most fun thing I've ever knit, I definitely love wearing it. So I thought I would talk about a few specifics. First of all, I designed this myself, but I did use a custom fit pattern that I bought a couple of years ago for a different sweater as kind of the basis for the arm side and sleeve cap shaping. Maybe? I might have just done my own thing on the sleeve caps. I'm always adjusting for gauge. Well, anyway, but the point is that I went in a little further on the body portion. Here, let me button it up so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I went in a little further than recommended for the arm side on the body, because I find that I have quite broad shoulders for my body type. That's not the part I find. I know that I have quite broad shoulders compared to the rest of my body. And I find that having the arm size sit a little in, instead of right on the edge of my shoulder, which would be out here, when it sits a little bit in, like right here, right now the ruffle on my dress is messing it up a bit, but I find that just creates a more flattering edge. So that's one thing that I just added a few extra decreases along here, and I'm really pleased with how that came together. I opted for quite a snug arm side because this was going to be a fitted crop sweater, and so I think it would have looked weird to have a lot of extra fabric here. This is definitely as snug as I would ever go. Since it's spring, I was planning to wear it mainly with sleeveless tops, and I think it looks really nice. I think usually I would give myself at least 1/4 of an inch more, maybe 1/2 an inch more, just so that I'm not sweating right into the sweater. But I'm really pleased with that. Hopefully you saw in the close-up that I opted for a bit of a decorative cuff and band. It reminded me of flower beds, and I just took that from the Kensington sock pattern, which I knit a few years ago. It's a pattern by Nancy Bush, and it's from the Knitter's Book of Socks, and I just thought it was a really pretty little cuff. So, let's see, other things to talk about. The button band. I had found in my gauge swatching, sorry, I need to turn my heating pad back on. For new viewers, I have chronic illnesses, so I have a heating pad behind my back to help me deal with that. Where was I? Oh, for the button bands. When I was swatching, and I blocked the back of this sweater before I knit the fronts because I wanted to know if the yarn was going to stretch vertically or not when I blocked, and it didn't. I found that it wasn't very elastic at all in the ribbing. Like, there wasn't really a lot of bounce back, and so I knew that the way I knit the ribbing, that eventually it was going to be stretched out. It wasn't going to sit snug with just the knit showing and the purl columns hidden. And so for the button bands, I have found in the past that if button bands start to stretch out, then you get wonkiness between the buttons because there's too much fabric there. And also the front of the sweater will sit lower than the back, which is annoying. So I opted for and also I noticed when I was knitting this that the lace pattern had a tendency to stretch vertically, and I really wanted that to stay under control because I needed to match the back, which is stockinette. So for all those reasons, I did a very snug button band. Usually I would pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows, and instead I picked up 1 stitch for every 2 rows. And I also knit it on much smaller needles. and I knit it really snug, and then I did a slightly looser bind off. And then when I was blocking it, I just stretched. So before I blocked it, I mean, the lace was waving. What's the word? Where it's too tightly gathered, because I had made the button bands too snug. But when I blocked it, I just stretched this as much as it would stretch vertically, and left it to dry. And I think it sits really well. There's no poofiness going on with the lace, but also the lace can't grow the way that it is tempted to. It really helps control it. And I did a very snug but very small neckband as well, just in garter, because whenever I'm knitting a sweater top down, I tend to not have a neckline as low as I want it. And so once I seamed this up and tried it on, I realized it was already pretty much as high as I wanted it. So that's why I just did a very small neckband. And that's also to add structure. I was really careful when I blocked it not to stretch this out, because I've only recently begun knitting lace sweaters out of wool yarn, and the first one, which I finished back in December, I accidentally stretched the neckband out and it doesn't fit as nicely in the shoulders, and I haven't been able to fix it by blocking, so I'm probably going to have to reknit it. So that is the story of the Blue Bonnet cardigan. I can't remember if I mentioned this because I've had to do a couple clips over again because of noises outside my window. But it's knit out of 100% Rambouillet yarn, which is one of the fine wool sheep breeds. And it's from Lana Plantai, which is a farm yarn. It was sent to me, which was incredibly sweet and generous. And for me, it's definitely next to the skin soft. It doesn't cause me any itching. And having those shorter sleeves makes this incredibly wearable. I definitely want to knit more sweaters like this. And because I was worried about yardage, I made the body pretty snug, as opposed to a couple of the cardigans I've made recently. I make the waistband snug, and then I kind of let the body poof out a bit. And I still really like how that snug body looks, so I guess for me I like it either way. But definitely cropped, because that works with all of my fit and flare dresses and full skirts. And yeah, so I've been wearing this so much, and I love it. And this is also one of the first times that I've knit a sweater where the detail is only on the front, and the rest of it is plain stockinette. The first one that I tried that way was the Audrey and Unst pattern, and that only has detail right at the yoke. And I tend to knit all over patterns or something like that, in part because I'm just drawn to detail, but also because it tends to slow me down, and before I was a very quick knitter and I was trying to get more hours of knitting enjoyment out of the same amount of yarn. But I did usually do the sleeves in stockinette, but I find that I really like the way that it fits. Like, I like how stockinette fabric behaves in a garment, and so that's made me think about trying to incorporate some more stockinette and maybe just doing patterns as, rather than all over patterns, doing them as a focal feature, if that makes sense. So that is the story of the past sweater, and now I'm going to go to the present sweater. I warn you, I've just been, so in addition to my knitting slump, I've also just, I don't know, I seem to be under a, curse is too strong of a word, but I have been making plenty of mistakes with my knitting. Not with the gift knitting that I've been doing, because that's the other thing. Like, I haven't really had to rip much with that, but with the sweater knitting and my personal knitting, it's weird. That's okay. So, after all of the drama of this sweater, I decided, and especially since I hadn't been doing that much knitting and it felt like my brain power was going to other places, so I wanted something really relaxing. And for Christmas, I received a sweater's quantity of Quince & Company Chickadee, which is their sport weight yarn, in Chanterelle, which is this really beautiful pinky beige color, in order to make a Colorwork Swan sweater by Anne Kingstone, and the pattern is called Wet Wet, which is a town in Yorkshire, apparently. And so this is also Quince & Company Chickadee in undyed, because they didn't have any available in egret, which is the 50 gram undyed, so instead I had to go over to their 100 gram undyed selections. Okay, so I have already knit this sweater once, and I am going to bring it up so that I can show you because I know that I'm not going to trust myself to edit it afterwards. Okay. Sorry. I've never had an iPad before, and my dad gave me his as a hand-me-down, so I'm still a little awkward with it. Okay, so here's the sweater, and as you can see, it is a pullover with swans around the yoke, and then the rest is just plain knitting. And it calls for, I think, 22 stitches to 4 inches, yeah. And the first time I knit it with a thicker yarn, so even though I got that gauge, the fabric was dense and tight, and also I used yarn that itched me a bit, so that didn't work out. I also used a raspberry pink yarn, and I found that if I'm doing something with like swans that's a bit more quirky, that I would have felt more comfortable with it in neutral colors. So I've been planning to reknit this sweater, but let me show you my first version. There's me a couple years ago. And as you can see, the first time I knit it, I added some color work at the wrists and the hem. And that was to try to balance out the shoulder broadening aspect that this pattern has, in my opinion. I've already mentioned my broad shoulders. I enjoy having broad shoulders, but I don't want to look like a football linebacker. So, for this version, I knew that I wanted it to be a cardigan because I just wear my cardigan so much more than I wear my pullovers. The only pullover I wear is my lace weight one. And I knew that I wanted to do something that would help balance out the swans. And I also, this is my first time knitting a sweater with Chickadee. I've only knit a couple accessories for my mom. So I took the time to swatch on 3 needles and decide which fabric I liked best. And I ended up preferring the fabric that was 6.2 stitches to the inch, which is about 25 stitches over 4 inches, so my gauge was a little bit snugger than the pattern called for. So I knew that I was going to have to make some modifications. The sweater is knit top down, and there's a whole lot of short row shaping going on. It's a paid for pattern, so I'm not going to get into too many details, but after much debate, because if I'm going to have a problem with where a sweater fits, it's going to be in the yoke. Just because that's the most complicated area, and I've got broad shoulders, but I've got quite a short distance for arm size, and there's just a lot of stuff going on. So that's part of why I prefer to knit bottom-up sweaters, is because then if the yoke area doesn't fit, it's much easier to just pull that out. And I also find top-down sweaters incredibly difficult to try on because there's not all that fabric that's pulling it down, and so when I knit this the first time, I was convinced that it wasn't going to fit until the very end because every time I tried to try it on, it didn't look right. But you might be able to see, especially if I zoom in, that there's some bunching there. And that's also in the model photo for the pattern, and it's in every one of the sweaters that I've seen on the project page. And so here, right there. I also wanted to try to avoid that if possible. But at the same time, I was excited to cast on, and so I went ahead and just started knitting it as the pattern calls for. The only difference being I knit it flat instead of in the round, so that it would be a cardigan. I didn't want to steek it because it's such a small amount of color work, and then if I ever want to rip it out, I don't have access to the yarn because I've cut it. I had a really fun time knitting this. There's I-cords, so you do have and the I-cord takes a while, obviously, so, but I think it looks really nice. One of the changes that I made both times I knit the pattern was to knit the swans in cream instead of using cream for the background, and that's just because I can be a bit pedantic about animals and I want them to be in their natural color. So I knit the color work. I went ahead and knit the rest of the yoke. I ran into one problem when I realized that I had knit a section wrong. The way her pattern is written, I think it works better if you print out your patterns as opposed to reading them on the thing, because it's like a worksheet and you have to fill the numbers in from the chart. And so, especially since I was working a different size than I usually did in order to compensate for my tighter gauge, I just got confused. So I ended up having to rip out quite a few of these really long rows when you're covering the sleeves as well as the yoke. But, you know, that was fine. So I then knit an extra inch on the body before trying it on. And this is blocked. And you can see that there are some serious problems. So, first of all, it's just big, right? Like, I mean, if it sits like that, then that's fine. I hate trying to try on top of those others, but since it's a cardigan, it's going to need a button band. And I thought about just doing an I-cord loop button band, but the issue is that then I'm having buttons covering up these swans, right? So that's not ideal. And the bigger issue for me, so when I pop my shoulders all the way back, it looks like it fits pretty well. But that is, of course, not how I go through life. I go through life with my shoulders like this. And as soon as I do that, you've got this big thing of fabric here, right? And I also actually, I knit a sleeve all the way down to the elbow to try on as well. And that sleeve was just way too snug. And I remember that from the original pattern too, that I found the sleeves quite snug. So I decided that rather than try to, and you can see that the neckband is kind of sitting up really high, right? And even though I think the weight will pull that down eventually, it also just seemed like it was stretching out even more than the color work, and so trying to do a button band with it would have been difficult, because that's how it would have to sit for a button band, right? And this was about 4 days worth of work because I got really into it, and it's mainly Stockinette. So I decided that it was better to just give up on it, right? Well, not give up on it, but start again. And also my gauge was significantly looser once I blocked it, which was so weird to me. But, you know, I've been having issues knitting lately, so I was like, okay, maybe I'm just, I don't know, in a phase where I can't depend on my gauge. So I decided that I was going to start again, but knit it from the bottom up this time. Especially since I just, one of the reasons why I decided to do it top down was because I was intimidated by having to adapt the short row and sleeve directions. But I'm a much more experienced knitter than I was when I first knit this. That pink sweater I showed you was only the second sweater I ever knit. And having just done it top down, I think it'll be fairly easy to adapt to bottom up. And one of the things that I think causes this wrinkling here is that the short rows are worked on almost every stitch. And I think that that just creates too much fabric here. So I am going to change that. When I knit it bottom up, I'm going to do short rows before the sleeve split so that I can do fewer short rows up here and space them out more and hopefully avoid this extra fabric. Okay, so I started knitting the bottom. And that's when I discovered that I had used the wrong set of needles to knit this. So it wasn't that my gauge had changed, it was that I thought I was knitting on 2.5s, and instead I was knitting on my 3s. So at least my gauge is still reliable from swatches, but yeah, so that's the other reason why. I'm sure I'll have to rip this out, but yeah, so this is basically how not to knit a sweater. Okay, so then I started knitting it bottom up, and this time around I've decided that in order to balance these swans on the top and make sure that those don't broaden my shoulders too much, I am going to do a contrast ribbing with these little scallops. Hopefully you can see the little scallops. This is inspired by a free Andy Sutherland pattern, a crop sweater for winter, which is a pullover with this idea, although I did use the scallops from a free hat pattern called Little Scallops. So, but I want to be sure to give like idea credit where it is due, especially since I had to buy a 100-gram skein of the cream anyway. I wasn't worried about running out of yarn. It only took 7 grams to do the swans. So I went ahead and decided to knit the body all in one piece, although usually I do it in pieces because I am going to still try to use her directions for the yoke, just switch. So I need to have the body, I guess I could seam it and just leave all the stitches live, but that seemed unnecessarily complicated. So I'm going to do the body, then both sleeves, and then join them all for the yoke. And I incorporated waist shaping, both in the body as well as along the seams, as usual. And basically I just completely ignored the pattern and knit myself a sweater based on what size I wanted to be. And then I went ahead and cut the yarn so that I could start the sleeves, but I realized that I forgot to do any short rows on the back, so I'm going to have to rejoin the yarn and add some short rows before I start the yoke. That's okay. Since it's 100% wool, I can just spit splice that and I won't have any more ends to weave in. But yeah, so I did find that Chickadee grew in blocking, so even though it seems snug right now. But yeah. So pretty simple, just mainly stockinette. See, bottom up is so easy to try on. Anyway, I know you can't really see further than that. And so then I started the first sleeve. And I am repeating the contrast cuff. And I had planned to do these for my wrist. And so I knit it pretty snug. But then I had actually knit the sleeve all the way up to where it should be just last night when I realized that I've been wearing my shorter sleeve cardigan so much, and that this is a sport weight yarn, which is a little heavier than a lot of the yarns that I knit with. And also that if I made them 3/4 length sleeves, then the contrast part of the sleeve would line up better with the contrast part of the body. And so after like awkwardly wrapping everything around me and looking in my bathroom mirror, I decided I was just going to go ahead and make them 3/4 length sleeves, and that it's a little snugger than it would have been if I had planned to do 3/4 length sleeves, but I think it still looks good. And Chickadee yarn is incredibly soft, so I'm perfectly fine wearing this with only sleeveless things so that there's not weird sleeve gaping. So once I had decided that and ripped all the way back to where I wanted for the first sleeve, I have cast on for the second sleeve, and I'm just about to start the scalloping. So that's where I am on the sweater. It's been really fun to knit, even though I've had to re-knit everything at this point multiple times. But that's okay because it's mainly stockinette, and physically it's very comfortable for me to knit again. I was really worried while working on my blue bonnet cardigan that my illnesses had just decided that knitting was not going to be something I should do a lot of in the future. So yeah, I'm enjoying it, even though I will have changed so much about the pattern by the end of it. But that's kind of what makes it fun, right? Even if you do have to rip more. The final sweater I have to talk about is one that I'm planning. Hopefully this comparison between like a completed sweater and then a work in progress and one that I'm planning is useful to you, or at least that you enjoy the exhaustive sweater talk. But let me know if it is. Or I don't plan to continue this format indefinitely, so if you don't like it, don't worry. This isn't going to be every podcast. I just wanted to ease myself in. Okay, so this will also be a quince yarn sweater, although this is Finch, which is their 100% wool fingering weight. It has 4 plies as opposed to Chickadee's 3 plies. It's still next to the skin soft for me. I've used it a lot for socks, but I've never used it for a sweater. So I really want to knit up both a Finch sweater and a Chickadee sweater and then wear them both and see which one works better for me so that I know, because they have so many beautiful colors, and that way I know which one I want to use for future 100% wool sweaters. I already know that their Turn, which is a wool silk blend, is one of my favorite sweater yarns ever, but unfortunately its palette is much more limited. So, this is the Sage colorway, by the way, and I've got 5 skeins of it, and I decided that I wanted to use it for a Tyrolean inspired cardigan, which is when you do twisted stitch cables and then you add embroidery later. And I knit myself some leg warmers and mittens with this technique last year, and I absolutely loved the results. So I knew that I wanted to do it for a sweater, and I thought that this would be the perfect one. I have a lot of Finch leftovers, and this is in their Odwin, which is an undyed heather, and I think it will look really nice with the green. So this was my initial swatch back in January when I thought I would be finishing this sweater in a month and then moving on to this one. And I tried some cables out of the Twisted Stitch knitting book, which are the Bavarian cables. And I liked them, but it was kind of hard for me to imagine where the embroidery was going to go. And then this one is supposed to be leaves, and it just didn't seem like it was coming out all that clear. And so once I realized that I wasn't going to be knitting this for a while, and that I wasn't going to be able to finish it for the owl that I had planned for the Harry Potter House Cup, so I could do whatever I wanted and reimagine things. So instead, I pulled out the Japanese knitting stitch Bible, and I decided that rather than stick to something that was very close to the Tyrolean tradition, what I really wanted to do was have a pretty cable and embroider some stuff on it, right? Some flowers. So I found a cable in the Japanese knitting stitch Bible. Okay, let me just make sure the charts aren't showing. There we go. It's this red one. I'm not sure how easy it is to see that. So what I loved about this cable was the intricacy of it, and even though there's texture in these diamonds, oh, there we go. Even though there's texture in these diamonds, I figured if I made it a plain backdrop, then that would be perfect for adding some embroidery. And I also decided to eliminate these little decorations so that I could put more embroidery in here if I chose to, because that's kind of what the leg warmers did. They had cables going in and out, and then you had embroidery at the crosses as well as inside the cables. So I knit up a swatch, and I wasn't sure what background I wanted for these diamonds. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but I started with seed stitch. And isn't it interesting how the diamond looks so much squatter? And I think it's because of the properties of seed stitch. This is a really stretchy fabric horizontally versus vertically, and so the cables didn't make a neat diamond. So I knew I didn't want that one. So then I tried it in reverse stockinette like this, and I do like that one, but I also wanted to try it in just plain stockinette to see how that looked, especially keeping in mind that I'll be adding embroidery. And I think I prefer the plain stockinette inside the diamond and then the reverse stockinette on the outside, although I'm definitely open to other opinions. But I like how that fabric functions, and in order to make sure that this cable continued to pop, all I did was whichever stitch was closest to the cable, I purled. So that just kind of adds a little bit of stitch definition so that it's not just cables over stockinette. And hopefully you can see all those pretty loopy cables on the sides. And so my plan is to have this panel running up. I'll probably have to shrink the cable for the shoulder, since as you can see, or I might end up just binding off for the neckline, because it'll be like this basically. So I haven't gotten that far yet to planning the specifics, but it was interesting doing such a long swatch and being able to really play with how having different backgrounds, which you wouldn't think would be a big deal, change the different elements in here. And in my earlier swatch, I had decided what fabric I liked for sweaters. Obviously, when I'm knitting socks with this, I do it on size zeros, and I'm trying to get as tight a gauge as possible. But when I knit sweaters, I like a looser fabric, both because it's not quite as warm, and I tend to run warm, and also because it's more comfortable to wear when you're moving around a lot. And in my opinion, except for right here, sweaters don't get as much stress wear as socks, so it's okay to loosen up that fabric a bit. But you can see the difference. I really like having that larger scale cable. I don't know why this garter is popping in, but and yeah, and it was really fun to have more engaging knitting. I've been keeping my knitting simpler in the hopes that that will kind of convince me to pick it up even when I'm tired. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe part of why I'm in a knitting slump is that I haven't picked anything that's engaging my brain. And so there are times when I want simple knitting, but there are a lot of times when I want to think about something. So lately I've been doing more board games and stuff when I want brain engagement. But this pattern definitely involves a decent amount of focus. It's almost only, it's not, so with traditional twisted stitches, the alpine twisted cables, the cables happen on every row. So if you're knitting flat, you have to do that on wrong side rows as well as right side rows, which is fun, but definitely more challenging. Whereas with this pattern, almost all of the wrong side rows are rest rows. So the cabling is mainly done on the right side rows, which should make it more enjoyable. And I just think it looks really pretty. I was inspired not only by the idea of spring and snowdrops, which are my favorite spring flower up here in western New York, where I now live, whereas bluebonnets are my favorite down in Texas, but also by the idea of like kitchen gardens and hedge gardens, and one of my favorite books is The Morville Hours, in which he talks about all these different historic gardens. And I really like how this reminds me of those kind of hedgerow, or, you know, like ornamental hedge gardens and mazes and that kind of thing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this unfolds. I'll probably cast on for it pretty soon, just because the Swan sweater should be out of the way within a couple of weeks. I'm trying to keep my works in progress very limited at the moment, since I have not been knitting as much, so I like to feel like I'm making forward progress. But yeah, so I'm excited about that. I'm debating whether to also make it with 3/4 length sleeves. Apparently just all my sweaters now are going to have 3/4 length sleeves. I wanted to also mention that for me, part of the planning stage of sweaters is paring down. So I had planned to, in addition to doing the cable that I showed you in the swatch, make sure I don't show the charts, this leaf cable. I think it's beautiful and amazing. However, even at a tighter gauge, I think I'm going to knit that sweater at around 7 stitches to the inch in stockinette. Obviously the cables will be more dense than that. If I want a fitted sweater, and I'm a fairly small person, I don't really have that much canvas to play with, especially if I don't want to have to worry about shrinking those cables for the shoulder. And so I still need to measure this gauge and decide, because if I could fit those leaves in, I think that would be wonderful. But at first I was getting stressed trying to figure out stitch counts and make sure that everything would work, because I think, oh, those leaves going all the way up would be lovely. But once I let that go and just played with this swatch, it became a much more relaxing and enjoyable experience. I can always put the leaves on the sleeves, maybe just one on each sleeve, or on the back or something like that. Or I can just use the sleeves for another sweater altogether. So the next part of the planning stage, as I mentioned, will be actually measuring out this gauge. It's blocked, and figuring out whether I'm going to just bind it all off for the neckband, or if I want to somehow continue and shrink, like instead have the cable here and shrink it. The rest I'm going to keep in stockinette, so shaping should be pretty simple at least. And I also haven't decided whether I'm going to do a more elaborate cable on the back or not. Part of me leans towards yes, because I love having decoration, but the other part of me knows that I only have 1,100 yards to work with. So I don't want to get stuck playing yarn chicken again. Which that's the usual amount that most of my sweaters have taken, fingering weight sweaters. So I'm not incredibly concerned, but I also have to keep that in mind when I'm making design decisions. Although the way this cable works, it doesn't snug up the yarn nearly as much as these kinds of twisted cables do. With these, I usually, if I'm knitting at 6 stitches to the inch in stockinette, I'll go the sweater that I knit, my Mellow cardigan, which has all those twisted, those panels are 9 stitches to the inch, and then the stockinette is 6 stitches to the inch, just because they draw in so much. Whereas this, I think, is a much looser cable, just because it's not cabling as much. These are twisted stitches, but there's just a lot more plain stockinette involved in this. Isn't it beautiful, though? I really love this stitch dictionary. So excited to finally get to use it for a sweater. But yeah. I guess I could always start with the sleeves, start those, and then make the design decisions later. As far as how I make decisions about sizing, I think I've mentioned this, but my body has started to change recently, and that's the other reason why I'm also knitting sweaters one at a time right now, is so that I can knit one and then evaluate how I like the fit. But my bust used to be 33 inches, and now my upper bust used to be 33 and now it's 34, and my full bust used to also be 33 and now it's 34 and a half. And my waist has also grown by an inch, so it's not, I have just gained a little bit of weight, which I'm perfectly happy with. I don't want to lose the weight or anything, but that does mean that I need to remember that, because right now when I do the math for the body, it's hard to remember that I'm no longer doing it for a 33-inch bust. So, but as long as I catch that, then that's fine. So what I'll do is I'll start out, I usually aim for around a 22-inch waistband, which is a lot of negative ease. My waist used to be 24 to 25 inches, now it's 25 to 26 inches. But in my experience, that ribbing will stretch as much as you want it, like as much as it's allowed to. So when I've knit the bands less snugly, what ends up happening is by the end of the first day that I wear the sweater, instead of it pulling in at the waist, which is what I want, it ends up bigger than my body, so it's not pulling in the dresses. And I have a lower waist than most women, and so when I buy dresses, the waistline on the dress tends to hit above my waist. So being able to put a sweater over top that fits at my natural waist makes the shape look a lot better, because otherwise the waist is at my rib cage, which doesn't really go in that much. So that's why it's important to me to keep that waistband snug through multiple wearings. And so, as I said, so I assume that I'm going to do the waistband around 22 inches and increase immediately after the waistband. I increase to about 26, 27 inches, because that's what my body is usually at, unless I'm knitting a deep waistband. And then I increase up to 34 inches at the bust. Or actually, I might have done 34 and a half on this one, I can't remember. I'm aiming for around 0 inches of ease at the bust. I find that that fits best. So all of that is really simple math. You just take your gauge and you plug it in to those numbers, right? So if I was getting 6 stitches to the inch and I wanted a 22-inch waistband and I'm knitting it in pieces, so for the back that means an 11-inch waistband, so I'm casting on 66 stitches. And if my ribbing divides into that, wonderful, and if not, then you can adjust that a couple of stitches in either direction. Like for the Swan sweater, I'm doing 2x2 ribbing, so that's going to impact. And then you add 2 selvage stitches if you're doing a seam sweater, because those stitches are going to disappear into the side seam. For the front, it's a little more complicated because you have to account for the button band. I usually do an inch-wide button band, and so for the front, I would start with 11 inches. I would take off an inch for the button band, so now I'm at 10 inches, and then divide that by 2 because I'm doing 2 front pieces. So 5 inches, and if my gauge was 6 stitches to the inch, that's 30 stitches plus 2 for the selvage. So, and if you're just doing stockinette, it's really easy to calculate the bust increases the same way. So what I do is I work out how many, with the exact same formula, I work out how many stitches I need at the bust, and then I see the difference, and I am working essentially 4 increases each time I increase on the back piece, and then 2 on each of the front pieces. So I can divide the stitch difference by 2, and that tells me how many increase rows I need to do. Honestly, I could do the math based on my gauge to figure out exactly how many rows I should be doing it at, but in my experience, my vertical gauge never looks the same on my gauge swatch as it does in the sweater. So I usually just do my bust increases every 8th round if I'm knitting in fingering weight or sport, like either every 8th or every 6th, depending on my gauge, and both of those have always worked for me. I do the same with my sleeves. Rather than actually calculate it out, I usually just do it every 6th or every 8th, depending on whether I'm knitting it 7 to 8 stitches to the inch or 6-ish stitches to the inch, which are my 2 usual sweater gauges. Obviously, in the case of this sweater, the fronts will be more complicated because of this panel, and I don't know if it's going to be the same gauge. So what I'll do is I'll measure this panel, and that'll be a certain amount of inches, and I know that that's going to be next to the button band. And then I will take that amount of inches. Hang on, let me just measure it. Okay. looks like it's 3.3 inches. So if above the waistband I want it to be 26 inches, then that means each front piece is going to be 13 inches minus 1 for the button band divided by 2, so 6 inches. Ooh, that math worked out well. And that means that at the waist, like right above the waistband, this panel is going to be a little over 50% because it's 3.3 inches. So that means that I will have a little less than 3 inches of stockinette at the side. At the bust, if I do 34.5 inches, then that's going to be, let's just do 34 inches for the sake of fewer fractions. That's going to be 17 inches minus 1 for the button band divided by 2 is 8 inches. Wow, that math works out so much better. We could just add that 1/4 inch back in. Anyway, 8 inches, and this is still going to be a 3.3 inch panel, and so at that point, right around here, then I'll have a little less than 5 inches of stockinette to work with. And so it'll be really easy for me to incorporate that if I choose to just keep plain stockinette other than this 3-inch panel. So I'll increase both at the side seam and right next to this panel so that it's more here. And then, so that'll go from being 3 inches to 5 inches. And then I'll decide, I'll probably measure my other sweaters to decide whether 3.3 inches is, so basically 6 inches plus an inch for the button band, if that is going to be too wide of a neckline. If that's the neckline width that I want, then that makes it really easy because then I don't have to worry about trying to fit this into the shoulder shaping, right? And having plain stockinette on the sides makes the arm shaping, when you bind off and then decrease, really easy to plan for as well. What I do when I get to that point, honestly, I usually cast on once I've calculated waist to bust increases. And then once I get to the arm side point, I just go to my custom fit pattern and I change it based on my current gauge and follow those directions. But before I had that, I used the Ann Budd's Handibook of Sweaters, and hers also gave me really good results for the set and sleeve directions. Although I think I always shorten the arm side on hers, because I want my arm side to be no more than 7.5 inches. Even 8 inches leaves too much fabric under here. If I'm throwing a lot of math at you and it is making you nervous, then that's fine. I just thought, since I was talking about planning a sweater, and I talked about it from the design perspective, I might also talk about it from the specifics perspective. So you'll, at least I, always do the arm decreases before I get to the neckband. And I almost always do crew necks. But, so the other thing that would make this cabling easier if I'm going to incorporate it into a neckband is that then you've got a little more leeway, right? Like I can have a neckband that's way up here, or I can have it about here, and both of those look good to me. Since this has quite a big vertical repeat, right? Each one is about almost 2 inches. Yeah. And since it would look kind of weird unless you cut it off in the right spot, so being able to bind all this off for the neckband would make that kind of vertical planning a little bit easier for me. Because you don't, like, you wouldn't want it to stop there, right? Because that just looks a little random. The other thing you could do is if you get to here and you need a little bit more space rather than starting a new diamond, you could just keep doing these swirly cables. And ideally you would have done a couple more at the bottom too to make that look intentional. And so you can get a little bit more vertical space if that's what you need that way. But that's probably going to be the thing that I need to plot best because you want to make sure that everything looks good. So first I need to decide whether I'm going to just bind it all off at the neckband or whether I'm going to continue maybe this swirly cable all the way up. And then I need to make sure that vertically it's going to fit in because I usually do about a 10-inch body before the arm side, and then usually I work another 2 to 3 inches after doing the arm side bind off before I do the neck bind off. So that gives me about 12 inches to work with, and it looks like 3 repeats is just about 6 inches. and then you're going to want to be able to add another cable at the top. So that math is going to be a little more complicated, but with just a little bit of foreplanning, it seems like it's going to fit in pretty well to a 12-inch length. So that was my live, on-air, unedited, sudden dive into the practical side of planning, which I had not gotten to yet. And obviously I haven't written anything down yet, but even just saying it out loud has made it really take shape in my mind. And it might sound complicated, but it's pretty straightforward, especially if you start by using a smaller panel and you've got a lot of stockinette to work with, because then you don't have to worry about trying to, you know, maintain the pattern while decreasing here and all that stuff. So I had a wonderful time talking with you today. I hope that you enjoyed the podcast. I'm shocked at how long it went on. I'm always shocked at how long it goes on, apparently. I constantly underestimate how much I want to talk about knitting. I missed it so much, and I've missed interacting with you. The new Instagram setup is really tricky for me, and since I haven't had my desktop computer, it's also been tricky for me to reply to YouTube comments. But I am back in my apartment now, and so with the exception of this week, the rest of this week, because my birthday is tomorrow, and we are going to have several days worth of celebrations for that. But other than that, things should be getting back into a more normal routine here. So I'm available as the Charm of It on Ravelry, Instagram, and YouTube. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, it was so nice spending some time talking with you guys on the very last day of me being 31 tomorrow, which is probably when you'll be watching this, Wednesday, April 11th. I will be turning 32, and I'm really excited about it. I hope to see you soon, and thank you so much to everyone who has gotten in touch with me. I love that. I'm not going to wake Thistle up because she's super snuggled, and with her back and stuff, I try to leave her alone more, but do not worry, she's in good hands and recovering nicely. Bye!